YouTube, happy Friday. So what's this term TERF? What does it mean? And importantly, is it a slur? Hi, I'm Dr. Rachel McKinnon, making gender make sense. Let's get started. One reason I want to do this video today is because there's this group of people loosely associated who take it upon themselves to focus on hating trans women. You might have seen people throw around this term TERF before, and I want to explain what it means, where it came from, and importantly, I want to address the question usually lobbed by TERFs against the people who use the term, that it's a slur. So, is TERF a slur? No. But why? So this term TERF, it stands for trans-exclusionary radical feminist. This is a group of people who are loosely associated in terms of various commitments to what's known as radical feminism. Well, there are many radical feminisms. There isn't just one. They tend to have some sort of view on the patriarchy exists and it's there to oppress women and that we should smash the patriarchy. There's some sort of commitment to women's oppression is tied to their bodies, their sort of childbearing status, and that this should be opposed. There's some sort of view on trans women, sex work, and pornography. Many radical feminists, but not all, oppose all three of those. So trans-exclusionary radical feminists believe that trans women are not actually women and so shouldn't be part of feminism's liberatory politics. Many radical feminists view pornography as oppressive towards women, as contributing to the violence towards women. And many radical feminists, not all for any of these, oppose sex worker rights. So some people refer to those radical feminists as sex worker exclusionary radical feminists, or SWERFs. So we're sort of talking the SWERF and TERF here. So where did this term come from? Around 2008, two bloggers, Lord Hell and Tigtog, who are cisgender radical feminists, didn't like that the term radfem or radical feminist or radical feminism was being associated with a certain brand of radical feminists who were trans exclusionary, who didn't think trans women were women and wanted to oppose trans women's inclusion into women's only spaces, such as the Michigan Women's Music Festival, women's change rooms and bathrooms, women's sports programs, so on and so forth. So these two cisgender radical feminists coined the term TERF as an acronym for trans-exclusionary forms of radical feminism. Part of TERF propaganda is that the term TERF was coined by trans women and trans activists as a way to harm cisgender radical feminists, but it's false. The term was coined by cisgender radical feminists who didn't want to be associated with these transphobic assholes. Well, that's the etymology of the term, and 2008 is not that long ago, but is it a slur? Well, there are lots of different ways to approach this question, and fortunately, as a philosopher of language, I can give you the tools to explain what slurs are, what's the relationship between slurs and a derogatory term, and is TERF either a derogatory term or a slur? First, I want to explain a really important concept in language between the use of a term and the mention of a term. When we mention a term, we tend to use single quotation marks as a way to talk about a term. So if I want to talk about the word dyke, that's a mention of the term. I haven't used the term as a way to describe someone. I have mentioned the term in order to be able to talk about it. Using a term is when we say a word as a way to use it, to direct it at someone, not merely to talk about it. So if I were to refer to someone as a dyke, saying, Michelle, you're a dyke, I have used the term, which I will now mention, dyke. It's important to respect the distinction because we need to be able to talk about words, and we need a way to do that. And we need to be able to talk about terms without being accused of using them. All too often, when we see people accused of using racist or sexist language, what they were really doing was mentioning a term. Now, there's some controversy over whether it's permissible to mention slurs, depending on who you are. One reason that I choose the term dyke to talk about, even as a mention, is that it's a slur that gets used against people like me as a lesbian. I will not even mention slurs used against other people that are not my identities. I will not, for example, mention the N-word. Instead, I use the code N-word to talk about the N-word. Even though we respect this distinction between a use and a mention of a term, that doesn't make mentions okay. That doesn't make them morally permissible. It's just saying that there's a difference between using a term and mentioning a term. Often there's a moral difference, but not always. Many times, mentions can be just as harmful as uses. So one thing I want to flag is that when we're talking about the term TERF, I am mentioning the term. But when I'm talking about TERFs, I am using the term. If TERF were actually a slur, then there might be a problem with my using the term, even though there might not be a problem with me mentioning the term. So we have the use-mention distinction down. Now we need to talk about what features do slurs have in order to try to tease out, is TERF a slur? As it happens, philosophers of language focus on and research the nature of slurs. It's kind of a hot topic right now in philosophy of language. At most conferences, you can see people working on the nature of slurs, right? This is a topic people have thought deeply about, and there are many different theories of what makes a term a slur. I don't want to go into too much detail in any particular theory because in order to address the question, is TERF a slur, it's not going to matter which particular theory we pick. All of the major theories will say that TERF is not a slur. And so what we can look to is what are some of the common features to all of the theories that matter in understanding why TERF is not a slur. One feature that slurs have is that they all have what we call a non-pejorative correlate, or an NPC. Not like a video game NPC, but a non-pejorative correlate. What we mean by that is the slur term, dyke, for example, has a non-pejorative correlate where it means roughly the same thing in terms of who it's talking about without being pejorative. Lesbian is the non-pejorative correlate to dyke. The slur encodes some kind of negativity or pejorative nature that the term lesbian does not. So all slurs have their slur term with their negative connotations or pejorative content, and they have a non-pejorative correlate that lacks those negative features. One important feature of TERF, for example, is that we don't need a non-pejorative correlate for TERF. The acronym Trans-Exclusionary Radical Feminists is the non-pejorative correlate. So it can't be a slur if the term itself is its own non-pejorative correlate. So that's strike one for TERF as a slur, and frankly it's a pretty big one. The fact that its etymology is as a non-pejorative acronym, and that many of us still use the term, not merely mention, but we use the term in this non-pejorative sense to merely describe a type of person with respect to the brand of their radical feminism as being exclusionary of trans women, is one reason to think that TERF is not a slur. Now I know that that won't convince everybody, so there are other features of slurs and derogatory terms that we can look to. One thing radical feminists or TERFs try to respond to this argument is to say that, well, even though the etymology of the term may be not pejorative, the way that people use it today certainly is pejorative, and use is what makes it a slur now, even though it wasn't a slur originally. What should we make of that argument? Well, it's also important to note that any term can be used in a mean way without itself being a slur. For example, a sneering tone, or what we call focal stress, where we sort of put verbal linguistic stress on a term or phrase. For punch is a way that we can make any word, as innocuous or as good as you like, sound mean. For example, take the term American. Well, in many contexts, the term American is a good thing. I am in America. I am not American, but many of my friends are American. Nothing wrong with that term. But if I were to come up to you and say something like, "What, are you an American?" That sort of sneering tone with that focal stress on American makes it sound mean. But the term itself isn't mean. It's just that I've used a neutral term in a mean way. And using a term in a mean way does not make the term a slur. Unfortunately, many TERFs are trying to say that many trans women and anti-TERF activists only ever use TERF in a mean way, therefore it's a slur, but that's a bad argument. That's not how slurs work. With that said, it is possible for terms that didn't originate as slurs to become slurs, but then certain features have to be in place, and they are not in place for the term TERF. One thing I want to note is a lot of the different theories in the debate over what makes a slur, mostly in the philosophy of language, come down to what is the source of the negative content of slurs? And is it part of the term itself, right? Is it semantic? Is the term itself encoding the negative content? Or is it not so much the term itself, but how it's used and the social conditions in which it's used? Is it semantics or is it pragmatics? Or maybe it's a combination of both. That's sort of where the theories are arguing with each other. Again, for our purposes, it's not that important where it comes from. It just matters what features slurs need to have to be slurs. One useful distinction is between a derogatory term and a slur. Some people want to say that slurs aren't actually that special. Slurs are just a more serious form of a derogatory term. I'm going to set that debate aside because, again, I don't think it matters for determining whether TERF is a slur. One thing we can do is ask, is TERF a derogatory term, thinking that derogatory terms are just a weaker version of something that might be a slur? So what are derogatory terms like? Well, at their core, derogatory terms cannot be separated from their derogatory content. Whenever you use a derogatory term, there's always a negative connotation to it. There is no non-pejorative use of that term. Take two words, short and runt, for example. Short, again, like American, can be used in a mean way. What? You're short. Focal stress, sneering tone, I can use a neutral term in a mean way, but short as a term can be used in perfectly natural, non-pejorative ways. No, it's a short film. We can use it in a way that isn't pejorative. It might just be descriptive. Short is not a derogatory term, but runt is a derogatory term. Runt is sort of the derogatory correlate to short, or maybe small, or tiny, or weak. Runt is always encoding some sort of negative connotation. It's always pejorative. You cannot separate the use of runt from that negative content. That's why runt is a derogatory term. So is TERF a derogatory term? Well, can we use it in a purely descriptive way, separable from pejorative content? Can we talk about radical feminists who believe that trans women are not women? Can we talk about radical feminists who want to exclude trans women from their liberatory politics? Yeah, that's what trans exclusionary radical feminist means. That's what the term means in its descriptive sense. TERF is not even a derogatory term. It is much closer to short than it is to runt. And it's nowhere near the seriousness of a slur. I'm trying to show you that TERF isn't even a derogatory term, let alone a slur. One response that TERFs have to this line of argument is that even though, okay, fine, the etymology isn't pejorative, and fine, we can use neutral terms in mean ways, and that doesn't make the term a slur, but there is something derogatory in trans-exclusionary part of TERF. Their claim is that saying that someone is exclusionary is necessarily derogatory, right? It's always a bad thing to be exclusionary. How should we think of that? Well, this is why pragmatics is really important. So we have to think about what is the social situation for the use of the term TERF. Is it one where being trans-exclusionary is necessarily a bad thing? Well, is there rampant housing discrimination for trans women? Is there rampant economic discrimination for trans women? Is there harassment and workplace, schoolyard violence against trans women? Yes, the dominant narrative of our society is one of trans-antagonism towards trans women. It is one of transphobia. So to be trans-exclusionary is to be in the majority these days, it seems. So to say that trans-exclusionary is a derogatory term or part of derogatory content is ridiculous given our social conditions at the moment. If it were the case that to be trans-exclusionary is like another derogatory term, bigot or racist, they might have a bit of a better argument. To label someone as trans-exclusionary isn't as powerful as saying racist or bigot. But even then, it's not a slur to call someone a racist. If someone is saying racist shit, it's perfectly appropriate for us to say, yo, that's some racist shit right there. You're being a racist. That's perfectly fine. Moreover, we have a term specifically for trans-antagonistic bigotry, transphobe, or to be transphobic. The weaker, more descriptive version is the one that I just used, trans-antagonist, or trans-antagonism. We have words for that. TERF is describing a kind of radical feminist who excludes trans women from their politics and doesn't treat trans women as women. It is descriptive. At its very worst, it functions similarly to racist or bigot, but even those are not slurs. At most, those are derogatory terms. However, since we have the bigot racist correlate for transphobic people, namely transphobe, TERF doesn't serve that function. To be trans-exclusionary is not to call someone a bigot. Not quite. The strongest argument a TERF could make is that TERF functions like bigot against trans women. It doesn't even function that way. It is not a slur. It's not even a derogatory term, even though it sometimes gets used in mean ways. One thing I like to close with is an observation of an unfortunate way that the term TERF is being used these days, especially by fellow trans activists. Unfortunately, TERF is being used as an umbrella term for people who don't like trans women or people who want to exclude trans women from being women in women's spaces, even for people who have no affiliation at all with any form of feminism. In fact, the term gets used against people who might be strictly anti-feminist. We shouldn't use TERF as an umbrella term. We should keep using TERF as a descriptive term for radical feminists who exclude trans women from their politics. I'm hoping that the trans activist community will eventually develop a better umbrella term, something nice and descriptive, so when we talk about things like white supremacy, we have something more specific than racist. I'm hoping we can develop something like that for people who are antagonistic towards trans women. Something like aggressive trans-antagonistic causing chaos, or attack with one T. I know it's not perfect, but let's find something. Let's find a replacement for TERF as an umbrella term for trans-antagonistic assholes. So there it is. TERF isn't a slur. Plausibly, it's not even a derogatory term. I'd like to thank you for watching this video. If you have any comments, leave them down below. Like the video, it always helps out. And subscribe for future videos. See you later.